Now we are.
Have we been online or not?
We are now.
Oh, okay.
So we've been
All right.
online. They are now seeing the Valentine's Day.
Okay, but they heard me before?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. So I'm not going to go over that. I thought that was fitting since Valentine's Day is coming up very shortly. Hope you all have a great Valentine's Day. And we've covered this, Camellias for Beginners. If you know nothing about camellias, this is the right place to be. Because we're going to start from scratch. You don't have to know anything about camellias. So if you're from, say, Wisconsin or San Diego, I know you have camellias in San Diego. And so you're from New Orleans, they have camellias all over. We do have a studio audience here. So I'm talking to them folks. And so you don't have to know anything about camellias to get up to speed. And I guarantee you one thing, after this presentation, if you stick with us, you will know more about camellias than 99% of the camellia gardeners that you meet on an everyday basis. You may not believe that, but it's true. Why would I show a picture of 5 people and a couple of camellia blooms? Can anybody guess? Anybody? Some of them. That's a real good guess. One of the things that I enjoy about growing camellias is that I get involved in the camellia clubs, garden clubs, and I get to meet people. And sometimes we forget with these different gardening clubs and horticulture societies that it's all about the people, not really about the flowers. One of the things that the American Camellia Society makes possible is if somebody comes up with a new camellia, they get, and it gets registered, they get to name that camellia variety. And so these are 5 people who have something in common. There's been a camellia variety named after each and every one of them. And I think that's kind of neat. They're not all related. But can you guess who likes purple? Okay. Yeah, the little girl is our daughter, Barbara Grace, and the one with the big red one is my wife, Cheryl. The other 3 folks on the far left is Vernon Howell, his wife, Catherine Howell. They're both deceased now. And then the stepdaughter, Peggy Miller. And so they all had nice blooms named after them. That's kind of neat. And if you get involved in a local camellia club or the American Camellia Society, you at least have a shot at that. And it's surprisingly easy to do. A little bit about the history of camellias. We're going to talk a little bit about the history, where they come from originally, like ancient past. Then we're going to talk about different types of camellias. And that's really easy to learn. And many of you, if you're ornamental gardeners, you already know some of these forms, you're familiar with them. Then we're going to look at a whole bunch of beautiful pictures of camellia blooms. And each one of the pictures of camellia blooms are going to have the name right there on the slide. So if you're interested at all in that bloom or that variety, you can just take a pencil and a paper and just jot it down real quick before we move on. And you can go ask your favorite nurseryman, wherever that may be, can you get me this variety? And almost all of the varieties that I'll be showing you today are in the nurseries. They're available. They may have to search around for them, but that's their business to find what the customer wants, right? So keep that in mind. Camellias, they initially came from China. They grow native in China. And then through the ancient times, okay, pick up your phone. They quickly started to spread from China throughout Southeast Asia and to Japan. And the Japanese also became avid growers of camellias. The Chinese are kind of like us. They like the big, gaudy, flashy blooms. The Chinese, on the other hand, have a culture where they like the little dinky, delicate flowers. And so the Europeans kind of like both. And they've spread throughout the world now. They were named after a Jesuit priest called Camel. His last name was Camel. As far as we know, he never grew any camellias, but he was a friend of the guy who was naming different types of plants. So he got the type named after him. In the native languages of China and Japan, they have different words for camellia. In Japan, for example, it's called tsubaki. And I don't know why I remember that, but it's an interesting aspect. They came in to the eastern ports in the 1800s to the US from Europe. And there's an interesting story about how the Europeans were able to get camellias from China. In ancient times, the Europeans had colonies all over the world, and the British, of course, were the biggest. And the British Empire had a colony, of course, in Hong Kong, but there were other colonies in mainland China, and they got hooked on tea. Okay, the British really got hooked on tea, and they couldn't live without their tea. And they got the bright idea, hey, why should we pay these Chinese farmers to grow tea that we have to pay them for? Why don't we just get the tea plants and bring them back to Britain and grow our own tea? And so they got some of these tea plants and they brought them over to Britain and planted them out like you would plant rows of corn or something like that, just like a crop. And when it came time to see what they had these big, gorgeous camellia blooms, but no tea leaves. And that's when the British finally figured out that there's tea and then there's tea, and then there's camellias and camellias. Actually, there's some of the main common types of camellias. The British wanted Camellia sinensis. That is the source of tea leaves. That is where we get iced tea and all the rest of it. That's just one species. There are about 300 different camellia species. And it's a huge worldwide crop, but nobody grows Camellia sinensis for the blooms. Everybody grows it for the tea leaves. And there are different ways to prepare the tea, and it's very complex. But the British never got what they wanted, but the British gardeners loved it. Okay. So the most common type of camellia you'll find throughout North Carolina generally is Camellia japonica. That is the old southern camellia. And it's a winter blooming camellia, although some of the Camellia japonicas will bloom in the fall. And I'll show you a couple pictures of those. But there are literally thousands of different varieties of Camellia japonica. So chances are there's something that you'll like. Camellia reticulata came over to the US in the 20th century directly from China, and it was immediately hybridized with Camellia japonica to make it a tougher, reasonable plant to grow in everyday gardens. And of course, they do very well on the West Coast, where a lot of the research was done, the original research. Camellia reticulata is the big, gaudy, show-winning camellias. And when you see some of the pictures that I'll show you, you may not believe they're real, but they really do grow like that. And then Camellia sasanqua is another species of camellia. It's typically fall blooming, and it's known for being very, very tough. In fact, when we teach grafting workshops, the rootstock that we use for grafting is usually Camellia sinensis. Camellia sasanqua, not always. Sometimes it's Honglu Zen or some other exotic species like Kumagai Nagoya. And then there are about well over 300 different species, and occasionally the researchers will find some new species in Southeastern Asia, usually. So I'll be talking mainly about Camellia japonica today because that's most likely what you're going to see all throughout North Carolina. They have large, some brilliant blooms way from October through April. They're evergreens. Some of them have interesting foliage, just like the petals of the flowers can be variegated, red and white, so too the leaves can be green and yellow. So you can get a lot of interest in one plant. They're very tough. Once they're established, they're very drought tolerant, and they do have a couple of diseases that will get them, but they're not very common. And as a consequence, they're pretty much carefree as landscape plant. In fact, I got an email last night from a member of our club who said that his daughter was looking around in the woods behind their house, and they stumbled on an old family cemetery plot, and planted right in that plot was obviously a camellia deliberately planted in memorial of the deceased. And we were able to help them identify the species and the variety of that camellia because it was in bloom. So that camellia had been neglected for at least 20 years out there in the woods, just blooming away every year, doing its thing. And I kind of like plants that do that. A little bit about the different flower forms. There's 6 different flower forms. Now, Mother Nature doesn't always agree with us, and Mother Nature will give us a mix of this and that or something in between. It's hard to determine exactly what the flower form is, but we humans, we classify as 6 flower forms for camellias, and I'm not going to run through this list. I'm just going to show you some pictures, okay? So the simplest form is a single, and it basically has one row of petals. And this is Tamanoeura, and it is one of a very popular variety. There are different types of Tama, Tama Americana, Tama Vino, so forth. They're all characterized by red petals with white rings on each petal. Kind of neat. So single, that's the simplest form. And there's the semi-double. And that is the most common type of camellia that you'll see pictured in publications and everywhere. It's basically 2 or more rows of petals and conspicuous stamens that kind of stick out at you. This is royal velvet, very popular. The next form is anemone, and that has a row of outer petals that are very distinctive, and then a convex mass of petaloids and stamens. We'll talk a little bit more later about petaloids. But this particular elegans supreme is the variety. And first, I remember distinctly the first time I ever saw an elegans supreme in a camellia show. It was about the size of a dinner plate. And the lady who brought it in had a greenhouse, and she was able to grow these elegans supremes that happen to have petals that get very, very thin on the outer edges. So if you grow them outside, the petals get kind of frayed, torn up by a little wind and stuff. But if you have a greenhouse, you can grow it perfectly and it'll be beautiful. And hers was gorgeous. So some of these flowers, when we have our camellia shows in Wilmington, the little kids will come up and touch the edge of the flower because they just can't believe it's real, that big and beautiful. But you can really grow them without being a super gardener or anything. Next type is peony. Of course, it's not related to the flower peony. It has a peony form because I call this chaos. There's no pattern here. If you look closely at this particular picture, Jean Claire, you'll see petaloids mixed in with regular petals, and down there in the bottom somewhere are yellow stamens. That's typical of a peony style camellia. Some people like chaos in their flowers. And then there's rose form double. This is Hayward Curly 5. And it is basically, think of it as a semi-double, but with the yellow stamens tucked down inside like a wild rose would be. And anybody here grow roses? Anybody? I've been told that if you ask a group of gardeners anywhere in the country what the favorite flower is, most of them will say rose. But I believe that they've never seen camellias because they're easier. I used to grow roses too. Still have a few. And this is formal double. And the formal double never shows any stamens at all. And it's characterized by this very, very regular pattern of petals. Yes, this particular one is guest star with white and a little bit of blush on the outer edges. So with that, let's talk about let's just look at some specific varietal recommendations for North Carolina. This week also is going to be the Chinese New Year. So I figured in honor of that, I would show this Fine Pure is the name of it. And it was registered by a guy named John Wong in Northern California and up at San Francisco area. And he hybridizes camellias using old used aquarium tanks. He grows the little plants and he'll pollinate the flowers, get the seeds, label them, plant them, and he'll watch every single seed come up. And of course, when he gets a good one, wow, that's a gorgeous flower. That's a very large flower. It's very nice. Haven't seen it in the nurseries yet in North Carolina, but it's just a matter of time. Camellia Forest may have it. I don't know. They're up in Chapel Hill. Okay. The next one is Bob Hope. Now this is a semi-double, a large, and if you like bright yellow and deep red, Bob Hope would be a great choice. By the way, pardon me? You would have to ask around for it. You'd have to ask them to order it. And there are a couple of very good camellia stocking retail nurseries in Wilmington. One of them is Transplanted Garden. Another is Pender Pines. And both of them, both Transplanted Garden and Pender Pines, have access to a very large wholesale camellia grower with over 200 greenhouses of camellias. I'll give you an idea what they have called Cam 2 in Greensboro. There are also 2 mail order nurseries that you can get their stock. You can look at the stock online, find what you want, and then just either call them up or do an online order. And they'll ship it directly. And they really do come in great shape. I've ordered from both of them, and they grow very, very well. One of them is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, called Camellia Forest. And you can look that up online to find the exact address and so forth. By the way, I don't have any interest in any of these stores or retail outlets. They're all great. And then the other one is Nuccio's nurseries in Altadena, California. And you from San Diego, you know where Altadena is. Okay. All right. So Bob Hope. Now, the next one is Carter Sunburst. Now, this picture I show is just not a particularly good sample of Carter Sunburst, but I show it to illustrate some of these camellia varieties will vary in their flower form. This particular form would be called rose form double, actually, because you can just barely see the yellow stamens tucked down in the middle of it, just hiding down in there. But Carter Sunburst can also be a peony style, and so the form will change for some of these varieties. It's not cut and dried one form and that's all you see. But also Carter Sunburst illustrates another thing that you find with some varieties, and that is you get speckles and stripes and all kinds of features that you would not necessarily expect to see in an everyday garden flower. So Carter Sunburst is very good. It's a very hardy variety. Christmas Beauty, so named, of course, because it tends to bloom around Christmas time. So you can picture deep green leaves and bright red camellia flowers blooming around Christmas time. I know some people who have planted Christmas Beauties either side of their front door so that they can have a great Christmas show when the family comes over.
Can you actually say those nurseries again? Those order nurseries in Chapel Hill and Altadena?
The one in Chapel Hill is Camellia Forest. Okay. And the one in Altadena, California is Nuccio's. Nuccio. Apostrophe S. I'm told that's Italian. I'm from New Orleans, so I don't understand Italian.
And Altadena?
Altadena, that is in California.
It would probably be more expensive to order from California and more costly to ship.
Yes, but they offer different sizes. And they ship via bare route from California. Camellia Forest will ship either way you want, bare root or with the pot. So, and of course you can just drive up to Chapel Hill. I mean, that's great. And as a matter of fact, if you're a member of a garden club, and I didn't want to get into this, but if you're a member of a garden club and the garden club wants to do a day trip, you can go up to Cam 2 Nursery, which is the big wholesale nursery. You can get in contact with them early, and they will allow you to take a club tour. And then one of the benefits is that you get to buy at wholesale prices if you take a club tour. They won't let you go in if you're just an individual or a family. But if you go as part of a club, they'll welcome you because they know they'll get orders right there. So there's a lot of opportunity in North Carolina. This is Betty Horton, a recent addition to the slides because I added it because it's a beautiful formal double. But it's interesting, again, because it has different shades of pink. It's not just some bland white or pink or red. And it also has an interesting pattern of petals. The petals actually have kind of a spiral pattern to them. If you look closely, you can see it. And in flower shows, that's one of the things that judges will focus on to determine a winner. Because you can imagine a table full of gorgeous camellia flowers. How do you pick between them? How do you say, well, this one's better than that one if they're all gorgeous, or they wouldn't have ever even gotten entered? So you look for things like a spiral pattern that isn't on every formal double. So that's beautiful camellia. This is Cherry's Jubilee. This is, if you've ever eaten Cherry's Jubilee, it looks kind of like that. And it's very pretty blue, medium-sized bloom. And you may notice that those don't quite look like yellow stamens down in there. That's because some of the stamens have changed into what we call petaloids. Sometimes the formation of petaloids is caused by weather. If you get a cold snap at a certain stage of the development of the flower bud, it will change a stamen into a petaloid. Sometimes the petaloids will be a solid color, or like this one, the petaloids will be white and red. And then sometimes stamens will change into petaloids every single time, and it's genetic, it's not weather related. So you can get petaloids, and of course, like that Jean Claire we saw earlier, you can see a mishmash of chaos with petals, petaloids, and stamens all mishmashed in there. So petaloids are an interesting development. If you like that kind of stuff, you can get all kinds of variety on the same bush. This is debutante. Now, this debutante I show because this is one of the 4 or 5 most common varieties of camellias in North Carolina and also Georgia. Debutante was created down in Magnolia Gardens, South Carolina, Charleston, a very famous plantation style garden with a huge collection of camellias. And to illustrate one of the interesting things that can sometimes happen with camellia activities, there was a gardener down there called Miles Beach, who was in the camellia garden of Magnolia Gardens. He was the camellia curator, and he was busy helping remove tree trunks after one of their hurricanes. And they were trying to save all the camellias, of course. And he came upon one of the camellias that had a label on it. It said debutante. And he knew from history that debutante had been created right there in Magnolia Gardens. So he thought, oh, well, maybe this is the original. And then he went back to work, and then he kind of did a double take and looked back at the tag. He realized that the tag was written in his father's handwriting. And what happens in the South with camellia gardeners is that they tend to be multi-generational camellia gardeners. And they'll know things like, well, that was mom's favorite, or that was grandma's favorite, or daddy's favorite, or whatever. And so debutante is one of those old, beautiful pink southern camellias. Very tough, very tough. This is Fashionata. It's a pretty good sample of a Fashionata. It's a very large. I took this picture only because this illustrates a feature that can be frustrating and not so frustrating. We always want to see the bushes with the beautiful flowers look great, but when these big camellias bloom, sometimes they kind of hang down. We call that pendulous. They don't look so great when they're on the bush, but if you cut them and bring them inside, you can float them in a dish and they'll last for days. So fashionata is one of those blooms that can get so big that you might as well just cut it and bring it inside, because it'll look better when you do that. This is a variety called Gigantea. Believe it or not, we would call this a medium-sized bloom now. But when it was labeled many years ago, it was considered a good-sized camellia. So they called it Gigantea. So that's a good illustration of how things change with great hybridization. Grace Albritton, this is a beautiful show-winning camellia. This is a formal double, and it has little bitty pink tips every petal. It's very delicate, very beautiful. It's called a miniature. That means it's 2.5 inches diameter or less. And this is not hard to grow at all. It just looks gorgeous, and highly recommend Grace Albritton. I believe that those are readily available in the nursery trade as well, because they're so popular. This is Governor Mouton. This is a very old variety named after governor of Louisiana. And Governor Mouton I show because that is, as far as we can tell, the oldest camellia in the Wilmington area. It is a tree out in a full-grown tree. It'll never get any bigger. It's about the size of a dogwood. They don't get any bigger than that. And it has a trunk, maybe 2 feet in diameter. Okay, very thick trunk, but not very high at all. And it'll never get much higher. It blooms every year. And the early caretakers have been very smart with this, because when it was found, it was totally overgrown. And they cleared out, but they did not clear out all of the baby plants of that mother, Governor Mouton. And they did not clear out the grandbaby plants. So as you go out further, if you get to Airlie Gardens, ask where the Governor Mouton is. And if you look carefully, you will see babies of that original mother plant that are huge already, because they've been around so long and they grow so well. Governor Mouton is not in the nurseries, but you can get Governor Moutons, and you'll see them all through the old Camellia Gardens in Wilmington. Now, in the Tidewater Camellia Club, we teach various workshops on how to propagate camellias. So once you take one of our workshops, any camellia you find, you can propagate for yourself. That's one of the features of being a member of a garden club, is you get free plants. The next,
excuse me, is that a winter bloom?
yes, it's a winter bloomer. And this shot is of Moonlight Bay. Moonlight Bay is very large, white camellia, and it's a semi-double and grows very well in the Wilmington area and throughout coastal North Carolina. It is in the nursery trade. It's readily available. This is Lady Laura. This is a favorite of many camellia because it's got a lot of interest. It's kind of a rose form double with a lot of speckles and stripes and so forth. A lot of interest to Lady Laura. It's a large bloom. This is a shot of Grand Slam. This is a very deep red. As a matter of fact, for those of you who are in the room today, I've got a Grand Slam for my garden. It's a semi-double form and pretty large. This is Hermie. Now, Hermie is a very old variety of camellia, at least 150, maybe 200 years old. It has many different names in different countries. It's the same exact variety. And it's characterized by this blush-colored inner petals with white rims and stripes and kind of a fluffy look to the bloom. illustrates something that happens with camellias to create different varieties. Sometimes camellias will be sitting there, you'll have your camellia plant year after year, and you think you know what the bloom is going to look like each year. And then one year you'll come out and you'll see a bloom that looks different. It looks different on the bush. And you'll wonder, what's wrong with this bloom? And the reality is, if the bloom doesn't have any kind of obvious disease, most likely it's just done a spontaneous mutation that we call sports. And that's how we get a lot of new varieties from whatever source. Maybe an insect has bitten it, given it a virus that changed the DNA, or perhaps a cosmic ray hit the seed just as it was forming and changed something. There are all kinds of, we know radiation changes DNA. So there are many, many different sorts of sources for DNA changes. But the fact is, if you notice a new bloom, a different bloom on a bush that you thought you knew, then we recommend that you put a little ribbon on it and mark it. And then see if the next year you'll get another bloom the same way, same different bloom the next year. If you do, that's a sport that could be propagated and harvested or even named as a separate variety. So with Hermie, it's been around so long that there've been a lot of sports of Hermie. So there's Hermie Blush and Hermie Super Variegated, Hermie Supreme, and all these other different names. Typically, they'll name it with the original name and then something added on to it to tell you that it came from the original Hermie. Some people believe that all you have with camellias are whites and pinks. And actually, we get yellows and we get purples. And this is an example of Deep Purple Dream. It's a beautiful little purple bloom. And it's very easy to grow. As a matter of fact, in the American Camellia Society headquarters in Fort Valley, Georgia, we have a row of deep purple dreams that bloom every year, beautiful purple flowers. And so it's definitely worth. This is the second of the most common camellias that you'll see all throughout Wilmington and North Carolina. It's called Professor Charles S. Sargent, but everybody just calls it Professor Sargent. Professor Sargent was, of course, this is a peony style. You typically don't see stamens with a Professor Sargent. It's a medium to large bloom, and it blooms prolifically. When that bush starts putting out these flowers, you'll see them all over. And it has a fairly long blooming season, a month and a half, 2 months long. And it will be popping these blooms continuously during that time. And there's been a lot of speculation why there might be so many Professor Sargents all throughout Wilmington and North Carolina in general. And the only thing we can figure is that some big nursery must have had a special on Professor Sargents year after year. And then they sold them, and they just don't die. I mean, you can cut them off at the base and they'll come right back from the roots. And that's great. So you don't have to worry about whether the tree hits it or not. It'll just come right back. So Professor Sargent, highly recommended as a landscape plant, and quite flashy when it's blooming. This is the third very, very popular variety in Wilmington and North Carolina, called Lady Clare. And if you drive through Forest Hills or one of the older neighborhoods like Sunset Park or something like that, the older neighborhoods will have lots of Lady Clares. They're beautiful semi-doubles, and they look great. And I look at Lady Clares in Wilmington as the sign that spring is coming, because they bloom in January, sometimes early January, when it seems like nothing else is blooming. And yet the Lady Clares are starting to pop. And nobody's doing anything special to make them happen. They just do that every year, and they'll bloom for a long period of time. But I'm gonna emphasize something that you might not be aware of, and that is Lady Clare variegated. We know that viruses and so forth can get into a plant and change the appearance of the petals. Lady Claire is almost a bland pink flower, but Lady Claire variegated gets a lot of interest, and it's a gorgeous flower. This is Lady Van Sittard. I call it a twofer. And a twofer is basically a semi-stable. That is to say, Lady Van Sittard is the white semi-double with the stripes. Bloom. I say little, it's medium to large. And it's very easy to grow. But the nurseries only carry Lady Van Sittard. They do not carry Lady Van Sittard Red. And Lady Van Sittard Red was the original bloom, and it sported, and they called it Lady Van Sittard and got noticed. So the nurseries carry Lady Van Sittard, but if you buy a Lady Van Sittard, you should be aware that it's a twofer. You buy the Lady Van Sittard for this bloom, but you will eventually get solid pink. And if you let that bush grow out, you will end up with about 2/3 of the plant solid pink and 1/3 Lady Van Sittard. So, and there are a number of other varieties of camellias that people have named, and they're great. They're great varieties, but you get more than you bargain for sometimes. This is October Affair. October Affair is an October bloomer, a fall bloomer, but it's Camellia japonica. And it's a beautiful little formal double, pink formal, and very easy to grow. And it really does bloom with no extra effort. If you have a garden that doesn't have much interest in the fall, starts to look kind of brown and worn out, you might want to go for some of these Camellia japonica varieties that are October Affair, October Mist, Autumn Mist, so forth. They usually have a name in them having to do with fall. This is Frank Hauser variegated. And if you will, look at the size of that man's hand next to the flower. It's just crazy. Now, this is one of the few pictures I have of Camellia reticulatus. Remember, we had 3 flower species that were very popular. Japonica, by far the most popular, old Southern Camellia. The reticulatas have taken over the big show-winning spots. And the reticulatas came over from China in the 20th century, as I mentioned before, but they were immediately hybridized with japonicas because the original reticulatas were a little temperature sensitive. They had trouble getting through our winters. So the horticulturists immediately knew that they needed to hybridize it with something tougher. And they hybridized with Camellia japonica. And they, to their great surprise, they found out about something called hybrid vigor. And what that is when you take 2 species that are closely enough related so they can be interbred, hybridized, but they're different enough so that they have significantly different genetics. When you hybridize them, you join them together, and some of the seeds will be the best of both. And you get lucky. I mean, a lot of them will be just kind of nothing. But with the reticulata hybridization process, these horticulturists, they were all PhD researchers out on the West Coast originally. They came up with this hybrid vigor, and the Camellia show world just went crazy over this. I mean, all of a sudden they were getting flowers that were 50%, 100% bigger than the Camellia japonicas alone. But they were, they took a little TLC to grow them. You can't just throw them out there and forget about them. Well, Frank Hauser was the first really, really big show winner. And it lasted about 10 years. Frank Hauser's solid red. And then somebody got the bright idea of putting some virus variegation into it. And hence Frank Hauser variegated was born. And Frank Hauser variegated has been the top show winner for about the last 3 years now. And Frank Hauser, I can vouch for it. It's very easy to grow. You can grow it outside in North Carolina. You can grow it right here in Wilmington, just about anywhere. Other places and parts of North Carolina, if you get up around Asheboro, Asheville, even Greensboro, you really have to be careful where you plant these retic hybrids. But you can grow them outside there too. Just needs a little extra care. Margaret Davis, it looks kind of like a carnation, doesn't it? It's beautiful. Still see them in the shows, does very well. Camellia japonica. This is Tomorrow Park Hill blush. This is a good illustration. This is a very large bloom, Camellia japonica. And the original Tomorrow was deep red. And then a guy in Park Hill neighborhood of Southern California had a Tomorrow bush, and it sported. He didn't know it was going to happen, but it sported. And he got that red. He got some Camellia show judges to vouch for it, that it was stable. And so he got to name it, and he called it Tomorrow Park Hill after the neighborhood where he lived. And then years later, it sported again somewhere else, and it created this Tomorrow Park Hill blush. So Tomorrow and Hermie, they both illustrate this concept of a network of sports that then sport, and they go different directions with different features. And you get into all of this kind of stuff. Tomorrow Park Hill is one of the most popular forms of the Tomorrow. This is Nuccio's Gem, named after the famous Camellia nursery out in, it's a third generation Camellia nursery out in Southern California. They're still in business and they do mail order. And Nuccio's Gem is not particularly significant as a show flower or even a garden flower. It's a beautiful flower, formal double, medium to large size. But I showed this picture because, again, it illustrates the solution that show judges have to this problem of a table full of gorgeous flowers. How do you pick the blue ribbon? And it's very difficult. But again, this particular picture illustrates the spiral pattern that you will see on things like formal doubles. A beautiful, beautiful plant. This is Betty Sheffield's Supreme. A beautiful picture taken by a friend of mine down on the Gulf Coast. He doesn't grow much, but he grabs all the show flowers, takes beautiful, and he makes them available to people like me. So great. Betty Sheffield Supreme is a large, and they don't allow people to name blooms with the word Supreme in them anymore, because sure enough, as soon as they authorize that Supreme term on a new variety, somebody will come up with something even more beautiful. So then you've messed up the whole purpose of Supreme. But this is a very old variety, so it still has the Supreme name. Beautiful. It's in the nursery trade. You can get this, and it really does look like that in the garden. This is Charlie Bettis. If you like big whites, this is a great big white, and it has been around a while. It's in some of the older gardens in Wilmington. And it's a good bloomer. It's a good bloomer. Now, this is another Camellia reticulata hybrid named after Dr. Clifford Parks. Dr. Clifford Parks was one of the three great worldwide researchers into camellias, and Dr. Clifford Parks lived in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. His son runs for Camellia Forest Nursery, Dave Parks. And Dr. Clifford Parks just recently passed away, but the reticulata hybrid named after him is very hardy. I have one in my garden. It's very easy to grow. It doesn't get much care, and I like plants that do that. So Dr. Clifford, if you're looking for Camellia reticulata, either any of the Frank Hausers or Dr. Clifford Parks, do you proud. They'll perform every year. This is Nuccio's Jewel. And Nuccio's Jewel really does look like this. It's got the stamens mixed in with the pink and white petals. It really looks gorgeous. Very nice. This is Ville de Nantes. Now, can anybody kind of think why Ville de Nantes would have would have been such a show winner back in the 50s and 60s? Any ideas? Studio audience? Well, if you look closely, you'll see two features that really make it a nice semi-double flower. One feature is the what we call fimbriation on the edges of the petals. It's a sawtooth edge. When you have those sawtooths on the leaves, it's called serrations. And when you have the sawtooth pattern on the petals, we call it fimbriation. So Ville de Nantes had that genetically. And so when you have a good Ville de Nantes bloom, you see the serration sometimes on all the petals, sometimes just on some of the petals. It is weather related and nutrition related, but it's a genetic characteristic. And then also, if you'll notice, if you look at the variegation, the white in with the pink, you'll notice that it looks kind of like almost like water flowing through the petals. It's not just a big blotchy white. It's an interesting flowing type pattern. And the French call that moire, which is the word for water. And, or at least I'm told that. And so this moire variegation is a very popular type of variegation. Very interesting. It adds interest to any bloom that has it. And then this is the Ville de Nantes red. This is the solid red form of it. Unlike Lady Van Sittart, Ville de Nantes and Ville de Nantes red are both stable. So that if you buy one, you'll have that one forever. It won't change on you. Now, this is the fourth or fifth of the most popular camellias in Wilmington and throughout North Carolina. It's called, of course, Perfection. And it's a beautiful pink formal double. And it's a great bloomer. And typically pink perfections bloom just a little bit differently than most camellias. It will bust out all over the bloom, all over the bush. The whole thing will be covered with these little pink, be quite noticeable and beautiful. And we're beginning to get into the time when pink perfections will start really blooming away. And of course, this is what I call pink perfection on steroids. Nuccio's cameo, of course, it was originated from Nuccio's nursery, and it's just what it looks like. It's a very large camellia, and it does cover the bush with these pinks, but not quite like pink perfection. Not all at the same time. So it kind of spreads the blooming season out more. If you like pink formal doubles, this would be a great choice. This definitely is in the nursery trade because it's so popular. So many people love it. And I have one in my front yard. So mine doesn't look that good, but it does look like that. So let's talk a little bit about what do you do with these camellias? Once you get that camellia that you really want, and you have a lot of choices, they really love well-drained soil, sandy soil. They can tolerate sandy soil. They'd like to have a little humus and some fertilizer in it, but you can adjust that to your suit. We recommend time release, gradual, mild fertilizer, anything labeled for azaleas or dogwoods or crepe myrtles or anything like that. That'll work fine with camellias. And that's another reason why you see camellias in such gardens quite often. As a matter of fact, I believe the Burgwin-Wright house has 3 camellias, and I don't think you do anything special to keep them blooming, but they're blooming right now. So that's pretty good. They like dappled shade under pines and oaks is great. The northern or western exposure, it'll give it a little bit more winter, but it'll shelter it a little bit from the sun because our summer sun can get kind of brutal in North Carolina. Not as bad as San Diego, but it can get kind of rough. So you want to shelter them a little bit if you can. Now, one of the things I will say is that the front of my house had full sun with no shade. So I chose to plant some sasanquas, Camellia sasanquas in the front because they can tolerate full sun all day. And they've done very, very well. So if you can't find something in one species, you can find it in a different species. we recommend you plant them about 5 feet apart. And generally, if you have azaleas and roses and dogwoods, most likely it'll be a great spot for camellias. Planting instructions, just pretty much a standard planting instruction for any fruiting tree. Of course, we don't usually harvest fruits from camellias. They do produce seed pods sometimes. And you do things with seeds because they're going to have unique genetics, just like any seed, but we can basically use the same planting technique as a fruiting tree would use, and that is you dig a hole about 3 feet, 3 times the size of the pot that it comes in. And the biggest problem with planting camellias, quite frankly, is people dig the hole too deep. And the camellias like good drainage, and the camellia in a hole too deep will be sitting there with water in the roots, and it will get root rot. So we recommend that you plant the base of the stem, the trunk of the camellia bush, 2 to 4 inches above the surrounding earth. So it's actually sitting up. It's in a hole, but it's sitting up, so that you may even see the roots, the beginnings of the roots near the stem when you first planted it. And you don't want to mulch right up to the trunk. You keep the mulch away from the trunk, and it'll do very well. Once they're established, they're almost carefree plants. They really are good plants. And of course, you can't get a presentation without a couple advertisements, right? You got to have commercials. So, but these are both nonprofit, not-for-profit organizations. First is the American Camellia Society. They have a fantastic website called AmericanCamellias.org. Very easy to remember. And membership is either $20 or $30 a year, depending upon what type of membership you choose to get. And I recommend people who want to learn more about camellias join the American Camellia Society for one reason. I'm not going to go through this big long list of features, but there's one item on it: a copy of Camellia Culture for Beginners. It was written back when we had an excellent president of the American Camellia Society, and it was written by Dr. Brad King. And he totally redid the booklet, doubled the size of it, put pictures in it, and it's an excellent primer for anybody who wants to grow camellias. It's really good. It's worth the price of membership all by itself. So I highly recommend that. And then the last advertisement is some of the benefits of joining a local camellia club. Again, I'm not going to go through this long list, but I'll tell you the reason I ended up joining the Tidewater Camellia Club here in Wilmington is to make friends. And it worked. I made a lot of friends. Back then, we used to have a lot of parties. Haven't had any parties for 12 months. But we're getting back to that. Okay, we're gonna get back to that as soon as enough of us get vaccinated. We're having the first ever in the country virtual camellia show. It's fully accredited and judged by the American Camellia Society. First time ever. We are the guinea pigs. This is the prototype. If you're interested at all in learning more about the virtual show, go visit tidewatercamelliaclub.org. And it's got all kinds of good information, lots of pictures, beautiful pictures of camellias. And of course, the computer geeks are on Facebook and Twitter and everything else. I don't do that, but they are, and they know all about it. They'd love to hear from you. So we have a number of different activities planned right here in Wilmington for February 22nd through 28th, I believe is the date, but you can check the website for more details. And of course, you won't believe how hard we had to work to get the staff of American Camellia Society to all jump in unison. This had to pay them extra to get them to do this. Thank you for listening to me go on and on about my favorite. Now, this is my favorite part. Are there any questions that I may be able to answer? And I don't know all the answers to everything. I will try to get you answers. Yes, ma'am.
How large does a typical bush grow to maturation? Like,
Okay, the question is, how big will a camellia bush grow? And the answer, it varies from species to species and from variety to variety. However, I use the Governor Mouton at Airlie Gardens as a great example, and it's very typical of how a camellia will behave if you give it long enough and it's healthy, okay? And that is, if you're familiar with the dogwood tree, it will never get much bigger than a dogwood tree, okay? Now, there are some species that will grow taller, reticulata in particular, but reticulata tends to be a little, what we call leggy. In other words, it's not a dense plant like you see these camellia shrubs that are just solid green meatballs. That's the wrong way to prune them, but I'll just leave it at that. That's not a healthy plant. But Camellia reticulatas in nature will just have kind of branches all over, sprout, and the big flowers on the ends. And it's a very beautiful plant that's different, almost artistic in its appearance. So, and they will actually get taller. They'll go up to the second story of a house or something like that. But it'll never be like a big oak tree or a pine tree. It'll never even challenge them. Interesting thing about it is, years ago when I was out in California, I got a chance to tour a garden in Northern California that had a lot of older camellias in it, had been around for well over 100 years for sure. And that some of those camellias were pretty large for camellias, but none of them challenged an oak or a pine tree. Did that answer your question, ma'am? Okay, great. Yeah. And yes, ma'am.
Should we fertilize your camellia bushes?
Should we fertilize our camellia bushes? The answer is yes. Okay, now how much fertilizer and how often? And the answer is when you see a reason to. So for example, if you're located in the Wilmington area, unless you're in a newer development, most likely your soil is sandy in the Wilmington area. And sandy soil in Wilmington doesn't necessarily have a lot of nutrients in it. It may have a lot of pine straw on the top and maybe some sod or grass or something, or mulch of different types, but it doesn't have an awful lot of mineral content. And camellias are relatively slow growing garden plants. They don't take a lot of strong minerals. They don't have to have a lot, but they do benefit from it. And if they're missing certain minerals, mostly trace minerals like magnesium and that kind of thing, if they're totally missing those minerals, they can suffer, they can decline. So we recommend that you use a well-balanced time-release fertilizer like you would use bulb food. Bulb food is a very good fertilizer. It's mild, it doesn't burn anything. Usually you'll see, if you're familiar with the NPK format of fertilizer, you know, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, you will see 10, 10, 10 or 12, 12, 12, giving you the ratios of the mineral content. And that, if it's time release, that'll work. And it'll last a long time, so you don't have to go out there all the time messing with it. You can focus on when's the next flower going to bloom. Did that answer your question?
Well, I have 3 bushes and they get all these buds and they don't open. And then the buds fall off.
Okay, but we see bud drops sometimes. It does it happen to all 3 of your camellias or just some?
One of them, that was another question I had. Does it take 5 or 6 years once you plant something for it to be established?
No, you can get blooms the very first year that you've planted it.
Mhm.
And in fact, I recommend when you buy a camellia from a nursery, buy it when it's in bloom, That way you don't have to worry about whether you got Lady Van Sittart or Lady Van Sittart Red, right? You get what you want. But so that means that if it can bloom when you're buying it in the pot, you know it can bloom the first year that it's in your garden soil, right? But what I think may be of more interest is, when is it established? And established is a vague term that we use to refer to the roots of the newly planted potted plant. The roots are now getting into the native soil. And then you know it's really going to hang in there. And I would say 2 years. Now, you don't have to give it special treatment for those 2 years, because once it's situated, you'll know within a few months whether you found a good spot for it. And if it doesn't look good after a few months, it's starting to decline, then I highly recommend you pull it up and put it somewhere else that you think will work better. Don't wait. Because there are definitely situations, I could tell you stories, I'm not going to take up a lot of time on that, but there are some places where camellia just won't work very well for some reason. You may never know why, but moving it quickly to a better spot will save that plant, and you'll have a great bloom. Bud drop is a little bit more complex. Bud drop can be caused by a number of things. I mentioned a mineral deficiency can cause bud drop. I doubt if that's what's causing the problem.
Well,
If just one of your plants has that.
I've just been disappointed that I haven't had more blossoms.
Mhm.
Now, I have a friend that has a bush that was there when she moved in, and it is just prolific. I mean, she does nothing to it, it just sits there and just has these gorgeous blooms.
So now, so do you hate your neighbor for that?
No,
Or- Okay, all right.
she's not.
I would
Good,
hate
good
my neighbor
friend.
for that. I would hate it.
But
But-
I just wondered why my tree don't do anything. They just sit there.
Okay, I've got a recommendation for you. You might not like it,
All right.
but it'll work. Join our local camellia club. We will teach you how to take an air layer off your neighbor's plant. She'll give it to you. She'll let you take an air layer. In fact, you can take 2 air layers and give her one of them, and you keep the other one. And she'll love that, because that's a free plant. And then you take your air layer and you plant it in your garden, and it'll bloom like hers. How's that sound?
Well, it sounds
It's
It'll
not
take
much
a
work.
while to get to be a big, I'll be dead.
Oh, No, you'll
Look.
get, we have people who take air layers, they get blooms the very first year. We've had people do air layers on established camellias, and when they harvest the air layer, it's already blooming on the air layer. So you don't have to wait another year or season. But that's my best recommendation. Now, we have other people who do grafting. We do grafting workshops every once in a while. And with grafting, of course, you need rootstock. Now, if this plant that doesn't bloom like you want it keeps doing that, then you can go out there with a baseball bat. You can hit the side of the plant and say, listen, if you don't bloom this year, I'm whacking you off and making you rootstock for grafts. I'm told by the older gardeners that works every time. Okay. All right. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
I have a number of questions. that
Okay.
are showing up online. The first one is, can you recommend how to treat scale?
Scale is a relatively minor problem with camellias. What's being referred to there is what's called T-scale, and T-scale is unsightly, but it won't kill the plant except in extreme circumstances. Most of the time, T-scale is just a little white substance on the bottom of the leaves usually. It can cause some little yellowing of the leaves. And typically, what we recommend is using a horticultural oil or a horticultural soap. These are all available in places like Pender Pines Nursery, Transplanted Garden Nursery, or any good nursery that has an assortment of plant supplies, chemicals. And these oils or soaps do nothing more then coat the bottom of the leaf. You put it in a sprayer, you dilute it, you put it in a sprayer, and you just spray your plant maybe twice a year. And just make sure you get the undersides of the leaves. You're actually spraying up into the plant. And this oil or soap will coat that. And T-scale looks like some sort of fungus or plant, but really they're little itty bitty animals, little insects. So they're so small you can't see the individual creatures, but they're all in there as a colony and growing together, and they suck the juices out of the plant. And there are a number of other pesky insects that will do the same exact thing, aphids and arachnids of various types and so forth. They're all interrelated species, a little bit different each one, but they're related, and they all do the same thing. They basically just want to suck the juice out of the plant. That's how they get their nutrients, and they multiply like gangbusters. And so we recommend horticultural oils and soaps to just gum up the works. They get all gooed up. They can't move. They can't function. They can't respire, and they die. And it's working when that white fuzzy stuff on the bottom of the leaves all turns black. When it turns black, they're all dead. And they're not multiplying and they're not spreading, and that'll take care of you for a while. One of the things that really helps eliminate T-scale permanently, or pretty much permanently, is pruning technique. If you prune your camellia bush such that the air can come in and out of the bush very quickly, it's an open, airy look to the plant. Then what that does is it eliminates the high moisture in the atmosphere that hangs inside the plant that allows these creatures to survive. They thrive in warm, muggy weather. And if you open up the plant, it's not as warm and it's not as muggy, and the humidity drops, and they don't do as well. So that's another solution or potential solution. Sometimes people will think that they're getting T-scale because they have too much shade, and shade can affect the amount of T-scale. But the fundamental cause is these things are looking for a free meal, and they're sucking your camellia juice. Hope that answered your question.
Wonderful. So there's actually two follow-ups to that. Do you have any experience with using Safari for systemic scale treatment? Scale apparently is a big problem in northeastern North Carolina.
Okay, I have no experience with that particular product.
Okay. And then the other one is, how do you prune camellias?
Okay, pruning camellias, we recommend, we do a lot of pruning workshops down here in Wilmington, and we recommend the first step is to step back from the camellia bush and look at it from 360 degrees, if possible. Now, a lot of us plant camellia bushes next to buildings. You can't look at it from 360 degrees, right? But you can look at it from different variety of perspectives, because remember, no matter what you do to prune your camellia bush, different people may be looking at it from different angles, so they'll get a different impression. You want to be able to figure out what's the main perspective that most people are going to see that bush from, and then prune it with that primary goal in mind. It makes it a lot easier to make decisions about, well, do you take this branch off or leave it or whatever, if you've got a priority in mind. After you've decided what perspective is the main perspective, then we recommend that you go in low around the base of the plant and remove all the branches that are 1 to 2 feet up from the ground. Okay. Now, obviously, if you've just planted a potted camellia and it's only 2 feet high, you don't want to go in there and remove all the branches up to 2 feet, because you've just killed your camellia. But I'm talking only about established camellia bushes that have some size to them. Okay. You can go in there and remove those lower branches. And the reason for that is, number one, those lower branches are most likely going to be shaded by branches above them. They're not going to be producing a lot of flowers because they're getting too much shade. And so they're not going to be as vigorous. They're not going to look, the leaves won't look as good. Most likely, if you have a bush that has any scale on it, the T scale will be on the lower bush branches too. So by removing those branches, you're taking away a lot of problems, and you're taking away a lot of non-performing branches and twigs. So also we know that insects can sometimes climb up the trunk of a bush, but they can also climb onto a branch that's dragging on the ground. So they can get into that plant a variety of ways. You're eliminating all of that. And then we recommend that you go into the center of the plant, not necessarily the visible part of the plant, but the center. You can literally, in some cases, you have to pull the branches apart and stick your head in the bush and say, okay, what's it look like in here? And oftentimes, especially with older camellias, you will find a lot of dead branches that need to go before they get fungus or infections, or bugs start living in there and nesting in there. Also, you want to open up that center if you can without removing big branches, big trunks. And the reason you want to open it up again is to open up the air circulation, remove the humidity, remove the darkness that fosters things like fungus and insect infestations and scale and so forth. So then when you're done with, and all of these things that I've named have to do with the basic health of the plant. They really don't refer much to the appearance of the plant in the garden. But we know that when you prune a plant, you want it to look better when you're done. And so that's where we do the health related stuff first. Get the plant to its healthiest condition possible. And it may take several years to do this, because we don't recommend removing more than 1/3 of the foliage in any one year. If you're doing routine pruning, you shouldn't have to remove more than 1/3 of the foliage. But that's a heavy pruning. I mean, that's pretty tough. And we recommend that you prune right after the blooming is over for that bush. If you have a large camellia garden, you're going to have different camellia bushes blooming at different times. So you don't necessarily want to go out there at one time and do all the bushes, because that might not be right for 1 or 2 bushes. But by doing the pruning after all the blooms are done on that bush, you're not sacrificing any of your beautiful blooms. You get to enjoy those, wait a couple weeks, and then go out there and start chopping on them. And next year, your blooms will be better color, better form, and bigger. So pruning is one of the secrets that the big show winning exhibitors use. When they all want the big, beautiful, gorgeous flower that all the other exhibitors hate them for, and they're going to win the blue ribbon, right? And they live for these shows. So they go out and they prune their bushes better than most of us everyday gardeners will prune our bushes. And they get the big honkers that win prizes. And so that last part where you step back from your plant and say, okay, now what do I need to do next before I leave this plant and move to the next one? And that's where you can really thin your plant. You do what we call thinning. And by thinning the branches, you open it up and you make room for new growth. Right after, camellias will put out their new growth right after they're done blooming. And you will be able to see when it's getting time for that bush, individual bush, to start putting out new foliar growth by looking at the ends of the twigs, and you will see a little foliar growth bud. It's a little slim, narrow growth bud. That is what turns into a new twig with new leaves. Camellias bloom on new growth. So whatever that foliar growth does, that will result in flower buds that will sit there and develop and then eventually bloom next year. So by pruning before the foliar growth comes out, you can actually pick which foliar growth buds are going to end up shooting out and in what direction. And believe me, you can spend a whole day pruning one camellia if you want to. I don't want to, and I don't recommend it. But growing camellias can become an obsession for some people. There's no question about it. Did that answer the question?
I believe that answered the question. yes.
Okay, yeah.
The next one is, when is the Camellia show and do they sell tubers?
Tubers?
That's yes.
Okay, as far as I know, camellias don't produce tubers. And there's no plans to sell potatoes either. The Camellia show is a week long from February 22nd to February 28th, I believe. It's online, it's a virtual show. And it is all online. You'll see the results of the show on the website. You can also, I think, get to it via Facebook. The entries, the bloom entries are being done from February 1st through the 19th. And it is by invitation only this year. Keep in mind, remember, this is the first ever in the US virtual Camellia show, which means future virtual shows may be different. They may say, okay, we learned that lesson, we're going to do it different, you know, and that's great. But somebody's got to take a chance, and we decided to go ahead and shoot for it. There actually was a Camellia show down in, I think, Covington, Louisiana, Slidell, Louisiana, that was an in-person regular Camellia show. They just decided to ignore everything and just have their Camellia show. Sometimes people do that, but we chose to do a little bit different. And the ACS was ecstatic that we were willing to try this. We'll see how it turns out. We will have lessons learned. There's no question about that. But it makes it kind of fun, I think. And we have this period of about 3 weeks during which the participants can enter photos of their blooms following the rules that have been set by the ACS. And I think it's going to turn out great. But check the tidewatercamelliaclub.org website. That will definitely have the details. I may have misspoken. If I did, just ignore me and go by the website.
Wonderful. Are there some camellias that are more suitable for flower arrangements?
Yes. The Camellia reticulatas, the big gaudy show-winning blooms, the ones that I showed you a few pictures of, those perform in excellent flower arrangements. Beware, they will make everything else look poor, but you know, somebody's got to be a winner, right? And then some of the japonicas will do very well. Now, I have brought for our studio audience some japonicas from my garden, but you're not going to be able to see them online. So, but some of them are fair size. Some of them, I think I've got a couple that are very large, and most of the others are large camellias, and they can be quite beautiful. They're Camellia japonicas and Camellia reticulatas will last very, very well if you pick them. And what I do when I'm taking them to a show is I'll cut them with a pair of pruners, and then I'll stick a grape on the end, and that'll get them to the show. And the sugar from the grape will feed the bloom. And you don't have to get complicated. I know people in our club who use orchid vials. They work great. I know people in our club who use little other things and add floral life to them. It's a product that feeds the bloom for a little while, and those techniques all work. They all work great. But I do it with grapes because that's what I was taught by the old timers in Wilmington, and it works great. It'll get it to the show, and then I can put it in a cup for the show display, and the judges can judge it. So a lot of people, if they get big camellia blooms in their garden, they'll pick them and bring them inside, especially if they have like a bridge club or tea party or something like that, some gathering. They want to show off all their blooms, and it's way back in the backyard. Well, they'll pick it and bring it inside. It works very well, and they'll last longer than you think they will. Did that answer your question? You know, several days easy.
Then let's see. Can Matt talk about the importance of picking up dropped camellia blooms? I heard dead blossoms may spread disease or infect the plant with unwanted viruses.
Sort of, yes. If you have time, definitely pick up the spent blooms, throw them in the trash, do not compost them, because they can sometimes get a fungus. And the fungus, there are different types of funguses that they can, the spoiled blooms can carry. We call those a special variety called Charlie Brown. And when the blooms go brown, doesn't matter what they were before, they're Charlie Brown now. And you get rid of them, get them out of there. Do not try to save them or reuse them, because they have fungus, and even composting won't get all the fungus, won't kill all the fungus. If you can, if you can clean up under your camellias, that's great. But I will also tell you the other side of that story is, if you go to older gardens in Wilmington that have been there for literally hundreds of years, Fairley Garden is one of them. Oakdale Cemetery is another one of them. They've got over 600 camellias in Oakdale alone. And other older gardens in Wilmington, nobody is picking up any spent blooms in those gardens. Okay, they just go into the mulch and feed the next generation, and they bloom like crazy, and they do not have a petal blight problem in those places. So I think it's a case by case basis if you want to do that. Certainly the show growers who tend to be kind of obsessive about things, especially plant hygiene, they will be out there picking up their spent blooms for sure. And it looks nicer in the garden to not have any spent camellia blooms laying on the mulch. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
What does upright varieties differ?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
So, if the person who wrote that question could expand on that, we can possibly get that answered. How do you spell airlayer?
AIR space LAYER.
And that's all the questions I have for right now.
Okay, I will say I'm from the South, so my spelling might not be right, but that's close. And we, yes, ma'am, in our studio audience here, yes.
There's a variety called the Colonial Dame that I've been having trouble locating.
Colonial lady?
Dame.
Dame.
Like the organization that these ladies belong to. Colonial Dame. And I just wondered if you knew any nurseries that had it, because I've been looking online and can't find it. We have two small ones in the garden at the Burgwin-Wright house. I don't know where they came from, but
Are they cool? Are they blooming now?
I don't know.
They're camellias?
Yes.
Wow, and they're at the Burgwin-Wright house. Whereabouts are they? Because I saw 3 big camellia bushes. One of them's labeled Magnolia Flora, that's correct. The one on the other end is Seafoam. It's not labeled, but that's definitely Seafoam. And then there's one in the middle that looks kind of like Creamer Supreme to me, which is a great landscape variety camellia. Beautiful bloom, big, large. But I'm not sure whether that's it or not.
These are in the dipping pool garden, which is way in the back where.
Is that up? Is that
Yes,
up on the, like
another terrace.
terrace?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to go up there and look. I didn't know that you had any other camellias in the garden. I'll have to look there. I'm not familiar with Colonial Dame. I am familiar with Colonial Lady, which a friend of mine used to have a lot of. And if you would like, after we're all done, if I can get your name and phone number, I will look it up in my books and see what, learn more about this Colonial Dame variety. And we run into that all the time because there are over 30,000 different camellia varieties. And when people misbehave in my presentations, I will threaten to go through all 30,000 varieties because I carry a hard drive with them all on there. And everybody gets real well behaved after that. They don't want to go through that because they'd be in a coma when I got done talking. But colonial Dane,
And one of our attendees has said that Camellia Forest Nursery has colonial Dane in stock currently.
oh goody,
Oh, good.
that's great, thank you, fantastic. Well, I don't have to look that up then.
That's the one in Chapel Hill.
right?
Yes,
Oh, that's right.
bingo, you're a winner.
There we go.
That's great.
And to expand on the last question that was asked, some varieties and nurseries say upright. What does that mean versus not saying that?
Okay, the bushes typically, well, this is one of my pet peeves, so I'm sorry. Landscapers are notorious for pruning woody ornamentals into green meatballs. Okay, does everybody know what a green meatball might look like? They do that because it's easy and it's quick and they can do it with the power shears. And they get done, where's my money? That's it. That's the only reason they do it. It's not the healthiest way to prune or even trim camellias, okay? But those of us who have seen a zillion camellias, maybe too many, we've noticed that some camellias have growth characteristics. You remember I mentioned just natural growth characteristics. One of those characteristics is upright growth, which is, if you're familiar with Italian cypress, where it's just like a pencil, it just goes straight up, it doesn't spread, and you don't have to prune it that way. That's the way it grows every time. There are other types of trees just like that, where you know when it grows, it just grows straight up. Well, there are camellias that do that. One of the camellias that does that quite often is called Yuletide. Yuletide is a Camellia sasanqua hybrid, which grows vertically very much, not totally vertically. It'll spread a little bit, but mostly it grows up. And it is a very good landscape plant, got a beautiful bright red bloom. If you see one, you'll remember it. And spreading yellow stamens. And that's a very good example of an upright grower. Most camellias will have a balance with upright growth, vertical and horizontal. They'll normally and naturally get into a bush shape. But as they get older, they'll drop their lower branches as those die off, and it will grow into what's called an understory tree. And that is the full maturity that you would see in a Governor Mouton at Airlie Gardens. It's a full-grown understory tree. It has no lower branches. It's all up at the top, at the umbrella part. Did that answer the question about upright growth?
I believe so. All right, again, that's all I have, the questions I have on here. Ladies who are attending online, we'll give you another couple of minutes to put in your final questions before we end the presentation.
Okay. Did anybody here in St. James Church have any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
We moved into a home that has a few. Our home is about 5 years old, so we're thinking the landscape is about that old. And we have one beautiful camellia that I fear that where they planted it, it will become too big for that area eventually. At what point can we safely transplant that bush?
The sooner the better, because these plants will grow root systems that compete with every other plant in the garden, and they compete very well. They can compete with full-grown trees and do very well. That doesn't mean they're invasive at all. Camellias are very well-behaved garden plants. They get along with all the other plants, but they will be able to compete for nutrients very, very well. And that means a big root system. The bigger the plant is on the top with the foliage, the bigger the root system is going to be. There has to be a balance between the two. And so as a consequence, if you think that you're going to want to move that plant, sooner the better. And with transplanting, that is a special evolution. That is not quite like pruning, and it's not quite like planting. So what we recommend and it's been a long time since we've had a transplanting workshop in the club, okay? Because nobody really wants to transplant their camellias, okay? It's a risky business, okay? But unless you're going to take a huge chunk of dirt with the roots, you're going to end up having to cut the roots at some point to transplant it because it's just too heavy if you have a lot of dirt there. You could have two big honker men and they can't lift it. You have to use machines if you get that big, and that's awkward. So what we recommend is that you go in to the plant and you find the drip line of the plant. Do you know what the drip line is? The drip line is the outer horizontal edges of the plant. And you go straight down from that drip line. It'll be roughly a circle, and you go straight down and you'll have a circle on the ground. It's in your head. And then you take a shovel and you push that shovel in. You don't dig dirt. You just push the shovel in as deep as it'll go all the way around the plant. What you're doing is you're cutting the roots, but you're not digging up the plant. It is not going to die because you cut those roots, because it has all those other roots inside that circle, still connected to the plant. And then you wait 2 weeks. And what these plants do is when they have roots cut, they try to put out new roots, but they put the new roots out from the stem, not from the edges of the roots. It takes a while for them to continue growing out, but they immediately start trying to put out new roots from the base. And so, because it needs a certain ratio of roots to foliage to survive. So it'll put those roots out real quick and they'll grow vigorously. And then those are the roots that you can take with the plant when you transplant it. You're not dealing with all these dangling roots out here. And what do you do with them? Then when you come back 2 weeks after cutting that circle, and of course you're keeping an eye on the plant during that time, right? When you come back 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's a variable part, but give it some time to put out some new roots. And then you go in and you do a heavy pruning. And this is one of the few times where we actually recommend people prune that plant that's going to be transplanted, prune it back 50% or even sometimes more. Because if it's a big older plant, it's got a lot of foliage and it had a lot of roots, and you're trying to move everything and have it survive the very first day that it's in its new location. So you should understand the challenges with transplanting well-established camellias. That's why I say the sooner the better, because it's more likely to survive if it's sooner.
So after all of the blooms have fallen, obviously, after that period,
We recommend transplanting camellias in the fall or winter in North Carolina, only because we have mild winters and the plant naturally grows roots throughout the fall and winter anyway. Because think about it, it's planning to use a lot of its nutrients and a lot of its water that the roots pick up and put it into flower buds and blooms, and sometimes really big blooms. It takes a lot of nutrients and energy from the plant to do that. So as a consequence, we recommend transplanting at the early part of that season, either fall or winter, before the blooming and before any new foliage is trying to come out. If you transplant in the spring, an existing plant, what you're likely going to have happen is the first time you get some warm weather, all the new foliar growth is going to wilt. It's going to be there, but it's just going to wilt because there are not enough roots left to feed all this new foliage that just busted out. Does that make sense? So give it as much time as possible to just sit there and recover. And that's fall and winter. And our winters are mild enough so that that's great. It'll do fine. Now, if you're in Asheville or Asheboro or Charlotte or Greensboro or further west in North Carolina, then some of these rules, it's just they still hold true, but it's even tougher to transplant an existing camellia. I know a lot of people in those areas that grow in big pots because they may be contemplating moving or something like that. They don't want to have to transplant if they can avoid it. Did that answer your question about transplanting? Thank you. Any other questions?
That is it. We're getting a lot of thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I know a lot of people have really they're very appreciative of the information you passed on and have been.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving us an opportunity, and hopefully this may lead to something down the road now that you are all absolute total experts. I guarantee you, and I will give you one last thing that will absolutely make you more knowledgeable about camellias than 99% of the gardeners out there. And it didn't take long in my gardening career in Wilmington before an old time gardening lady, we got to talking about Camellias sasanquas. And of course, people being loose with their language, they just called them sasanquas. And the gardening lady, who I'm sure was very knowledgeable, said, that's not a camellia, that's a sasanqua. And what that meant to me was that many people think it's either this or that. They don't realize it's all interrelated. And sasanquas are just one species of camellias for our gardens. There are some situations where Camellia sasanquas are absolutely the best choice. As I mentioned briefly before, the front of my house is full sun all day. And the Camellia sasanquas that I planted in a row in front of our house, they bloom every single year without any effort on my part at all. They're great plants. So also Camellia sasanquas do great for green screens and hedges because they're so tough. And as a matter of fact, for many, many years, the folks up in Eastern Long Island, New York, used to grow Chinese privet bushes for hedges up there because they were so tough through the winters. But now they've started growing Camellia sasanquas because they get the same beautiful hedges, but they're darker, beautiful green leaves, and they get blooms once a year. So it's kind of nice. I never would have expected them to be growing Camellia sasanquas in New York. But anyway, that's my last point. Thank you very much for attending. Enjoyed it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.